For almost 300 years, the biggest maps of Asia carried one name across the top. Not Russia, not China, Tartary. Then, in about 2 generations, it slipped out of the story almost entirely. Pull up a world map printed in 1650, or 1700, or 1770, and you'll find it there. Grand Tartary, Great Tartary, stretching from the Caspian Sea all the way to the Pacific. The Encyclopedia Britannica gave it a full entry. Map makers gave it borders and color. It sat in the finest reference books of its day. Then, somewhere in the 1800s, the word just thinned out. It faded from the maps, faded from the school books, until most people alive right now have never once heard it. So the question worth sitting with is simple. How does a name that big, on that many maps, for that long, end up as something almost nobody remembers? Quick pause. If you keep coming back here, thank you. You're the reason I keep digging. A subscribe and a like help more than you'd think. And one honest note, all of this is just the best I've been able to piece together from old maps and old books. If it clashes with what you were taught, no hard feelings. None of it's the last word, and the picture can always change. Start with the reference books, since those are the easiest to check. The 1771 Encyclopedia Britannica, 3rd volume, calls Tartary a vast country in the northern parts of Asia, Great Tartary, and then lists its pieces. The Tartars south of Muscovy, the Kalmuk Tartars by the Caspian Sea, the Uzbek Tartars and Moguls north of Persia and India, the Tibetans northwest of China. A geography book from 1701 goes further and calls it the largest single region on the whole continent of Asia. Even today's encyclopedias admit the name was in use from the Middle Ages right up into the 20th century, covering everything from the Caspian and the Urals to the Pacific. And it wasn't only maps and definitions. There were whole travel books written about going there, travels in Tartary, Tibet, and China, pedestrian journeys through Russia and Siberian Tartary to the frontiers of China. People packed their bags, went to Tartary, came home, and published about it, the same way you'd write up a trip to France. So this isn't a hidden rumor. It's plainly written in the most respectable books money could buy, which raises the obvious follow-up. If it was that ordinary to write down, why does it feel so foreign to us? Somewhere in the 1700s, one geography table put hard numbers to it. It split Tartary into 3 parts: Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, and Muscovite Tartary. And Muscovite Tartary, the Russian-facing piece, came in at 3,050,000 square miles. On that entire list, nothing else was bigger. Travelers treated it as a real destination too. There's a book from the 1600s, The Voyages and Travels of the Ambassadors, running through Muscovy, Tartary, and Persia across 7 volumes. 7 volumes! Nobody writes 7 volumes about a blank space. Sit with that for a second. This isn't a small forgotten province tucked into a corner. It's the single largest entry anyone bothered to measure, sitting quietly under a name we're now told meant almost nothing. An empty, meaningless land doesn't usually come with what shows up next. Here's a smaller thread, but a telling one. Picture the image you carry of Genghis Khan or Timur, the one history calls Tamerlane, or Batu Khan. Now look at how European books from the 15th through the 18th centuries actually drew those same men. It's a different world. Genghis in flowing robes and a plumed turban, looking closer to an Ottoman sultan than anything in a modern textbook. Tamerlane engraved as a long-haired, almost European-looking king in armor, captioned Emperor of Tartary. There's even a bust of Batu Khan standing in Turkey with dates carved under it that don't match the ones we get in school. Maybe every one of those artists was simply guessing from hearsay. Or maybe the people closer to the time pictured a Tartary that was far more mixed, more faces, more cultures than the tidy version we ended up with. Then there are the flag books, the old maritime flag tables. The charts that laid out the colors of every nation side by side list Tartary right there among China, Persia, Japan, and Arabia. Its flag carried an owl, the emperor's flag a griffin on a yellow field. And notice this, in those same charts, Tartary and China sit as two separate entries, each with its own banner, not the same place. Some of these flag charts were still being printed as late as the 1860s. There's a genealogy too, a printed family tree of the former Tartar emperors traced back through the line of Genghis Khan. Blank Wilderness doesn't get its own crest. It doesn't get a griffin, an owl, or a chart of exactly who ruled and when. The hardest thread to wave away is the language. A traveler's account from 1739 describes the Tartarian written script and makes a strange claim, that the characters read equally well forwards or backwards, so someone watching from across the room could read your open book upside down faster than you could read it yourself. Odd thing to invent. Now jump to 1849 to a newspaper in Washington. A well-known singer advertises a performance where she'll sing in 6 languages: Russian, German, English, French, Italian, and Tartarian. Right there in the list, sitting beside Russian and French like the most normal thing in the world. Not a dead relic, a living language an American audience was expected to recognize. So we've got a name, a size, a bloodline, a flag, and a language. What we don't have is the country itself. Where did it go? This next part goes quieter, not louder. A French missionary named Huck traveled through the region in the 1840s and wrote in 1855 about stumbling on the ruins of great abandoned cities out in the emptiness. And here's what struck him. Unlike the ruins of Greece or Egypt, of these old cities of Tartary, in his words, not a tradition remained. Tombs without an epitaph. No one left who could tell him what the place had even been. A local shepherd knew it only as the old town. You can even watch the word itself fade. Track how often Tartary appears in printed books over time, and it climbs through the 1600s and 1700s, holds through the early 1800s, then slides down and down until it all but flatlines by the 20th century, like a word being quietly set down and never picked back up. Then, much later, a piece of paper. In 1957, the CIA wrote an internal report, declassified decades afterward, describing how the history of the Tatars was deliberately rewritten under Soviet rule. It even quotes a 1944 order to revise Tatar history and strip out certain references. That part isn't a theory, it's on the record. What that rewriting actually erased is where people start to disagree. So here's the honest split. The standard answer, the one most historians give, is fairly ordinary. Tartary, they say, was never a single unified country at all. It was a broad European label, a catch-all that outsiders threw over a huge half-known stretch of Asia filled with many different Turkic and Mongol peoples. As mapmakers learned the land and as Russia and China pushed their real borders outward, the vague old word simply stopped being useful and dropped away. Clean, reasonable, and it probably explains most of what we've just seen, but it leaves a few threads dangling, because a vague label doesn't usually get its own flag with an owl on it. It doesn't get an emperor's griffin, a printed royal genealogy, and the language a woman could sing on a stage in 1849. Those are the things a country has, not a placeholder scrawled across a half-explored map. So maybe that's all it ever was, an outdated word for a place nobody had mapped properly yet, worn smooth by better maps and harder borders. Or maybe that word carried more than what's left in our hands today. Either way, the strange fact stands. Something that once filled the biggest maps on Earth under its own name faded until most of us never heard it once. That's the part I keep turning over. If a name that large can go that quiet, how much of the old world have we simply stopped repeating? If this one stuck with you, pass it to someone who'd argue about it. And in part 2, I follow the strangest thread of all, the one where Napoleon and the Tsar may not have been enemies at all.